What's good, YouTube? It's your boy, Blue Blood Sports TV, back at y'all with another one. So, colorful analyst Max Kellerman made mention when asked about why isn't undefeated three-division world champion, former junior welterweight undisputed world champion, and currently the WBO welterweight world champion, Terence Bud Crawford, getting the big fights? Or why does it seem like he's not so eager to make the big fights? And Max Kellerman responded by saying, it's not Terence Crawford. Terence Crawford will fight any and everybody, anywhere. It's more so that the PBC fighters don't have to fight Terence Crawford because they have other high-profile, high big money fights amongst each other. So they don't have to fight Terence Crawford. They don't make mention of Terence Crawford. Then he goes on to say, the one guy that offers his services to fight Terence Crawford is two-time welterweight world champion, Showtime's Shawn Porter. He says, but that's not really a fight the people want to see. It's a good fight, but the fight that everybody wants to see is Terence Crawford versus undefeated unified WBC IBF welterweight world champion superstar boxer Earl True Spence Jr. So he says that, Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence Jr. is the fight to see. So he completely dismisses. He says nobody really wants to see Shawn Porter fight. It's just not a high-profile fight. It's a good fight, a good name, but it's not a high-profile fight. This is what Max Kellerman had to say. So he completely dismisses Shawn Porter and the level of competition it is. But yet, at the same token, he says that the guys at the PBC are fighting high-quality, big money fights amongst each other. So isn't Shawn Porter amongst the high-quality, big money fight guys that are competing against one another at the PBC? Wouldn't that make for a big money, high-profile fight for Terence Crawford as well? There's only one Errol Spence. And see, here's where everybody falls into, they only want to see Terence Crawford versus Errol Spence. And I get it. That's the biggest fight in the sport of boxing. But there's other big fights for Errol Spence as we see him going into a high-profile fight with a former two-division world champion, former junior welterweight unified world champion, and former welterweight WBC world champion, superstar boxer Danny Swift Garcia, December 5th. He was just in the Fight of the Year fight against that very same two-time world champion, Showtime Shawn Porter, September 28th in his last fight of 2019. We want to see Terence Crawford in with the big fights. Yes, the big fight, the biggest fight, should I say, is him and Errol Spence. But there's other big fights to be made. And if you have the mindset that only fight that needs to be made is Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, then you're missing out, living in the moment, because there's other huge fights that can be made for Terence Crawford, and one is Shawn Porter. Shawn Porter and Terence Crawford is probably the second best fight for Terence Crawford at welterweight, not named Errol Spence. Because I think that Terence Crawford's skill set would be just too much for that of Manny Pac-Man Pacquiao, who still campaigns and competes and is still, after becoming an 8th division world champion, still the WBA welterweight world champion after beating undefeated former unified WBC WBA welterweight world champion superstar boxer Keith One-Time Thurman. Keith One-Time Thurman is another big name fight for Terence Crawford. As far as a competitive standpoint, you have a hard time imagining Terence Crawford just going in the ring and dominating Shawn Porter. You've never seen Shawn Porter dominated in none of his 3 losses on his resume. He lost to Special K. Kell Brook, who is going to be Terence Crawford's next opponent November 14th. But he lost to Kell Brook back in 2014, 6 years ago. And that was a very, very close fight, in which it was the fight that Kell Brook picked up the IBF strap from Shawn Porter In return, we saw Errol Spence go to the UK and pick that same IBF strap up from Kell Brook. That's thus the reason why Errol Spence is the IBF welterweight world champion. With that said, then you saw Shawn Porter in the fight and losing to Keith one-time Thurman. Another very, very close fight. Another very, very close loss that could have went in either direction. Then you saw him lose September 28th to Errol Spence Jr. Another very, very close fight. I don't think it was so much of a pick'em fight at that point. I think Errol Spence separated himself, winning the 10th round, winning the 11th round, dropping Shawn Porter in the 11th round, and then clearly winning the 12th round. So he won the championship rounds. He separated himself. It was a close fight up until the 10th round, but then he won 3 rounds in a row and dropping Shawn Porter. That created the separation. So Shawn Porter beat Danny Garcia. So there's a lot of round robin taking place, but Terence Crawford is not participating. And these are all big fights, legacy fights, that Terence Crawford should be making. So when Max Kellerman, a highly educated boxing mind, says that and dismisses Shawn Porter and says, well, the fight we want to see is Terence Crawford and Terence Crawford and Errol Spence, and dismissing a fight with Terence Crawford and Shawn Porter, that's what's wrong with the sport of boxing today. At the end of the day, yes, that's a massive fight, but we want to see the best versus the best. Point blank and period. Yes, Deontay Wilder versus Anthony Joshua was the biggest fight in boxing. Deontay Wilder, Tyson Fury is the biggest fight in boxing. But guess what? Deontay Wilder versus Luis King Kong Ortiz was a massive fight, and it didn't do bad. It did fairly well, right? Because you still want to see the best versus the best. If Tyson Fury right now fought Luis Ortiz, it would be a massive fight, and so Anthony Joshua and Ortiz. Yes, you want to see them against one another, but you don't mind seeing them against the Luis Ortizes of the world, right? So you want to see the best versus the best. Not just, well, if he don't fight Errol Spence, then he shouldn't work. It doesn't matter who he fights until he fights Errol Spence. No, as a boxing mind, right, it's irresponsible to dismiss Shawn Porter when you're Max Kellerman and you know Shawn Porter is a 50-50 fight for Terence Crawford. Now, I personally would favor Terence Crawford in that fight because I think he just has more tools in the toolbox. I think he would make the necessary adjustments to offset Shawn Porter. But guess what? He's going to have to dig deep in that fight to do so. He's going to have to, Shawn Porter's mentally and physically going to take Terence Crawford to a place he's never been as a professional in his pro career. And he's going to have to dig deep and find a way to be successful in that fight. And it very well could go in the direction of Shawn Porter because Shawn Porter has shown us versatility. Shawn Porter has shown us that he can box from the outside as well as he could box on the inside. His go-to is that he's a pressure fighter, right? He puts a lot of pressure on you, and he's very, very active. He don't give you a break. He makes you work every second, every minute of every round, and he mentally and physically drains you until he's victorious because he's never out of shape. He's active amongst active amongst active. He's probably the most active fighter in the sport of boxing currently today, and he's one of the most active fighters in the history of the sport of boxing with his style. And so his style is very difficult to deal with. Thus the reason why I just made reference to you never seeing him, even in his losses, get blown out. They're all very, very close fights. Outside of the Errol Spence fight, there's a lot of people that could say, I thought the Keith Thurman fight was a draw. I thought he beat Kell Brook. I thought the Kell Brook fight was a draw. I thought he beat Keith Thurman. So see, there's always this conversation when it comes to Shawn Porter, even in a loss. So to dismiss Shawn Porter as a viable opponent for Terence Crawford because you want to see Errol Spence and Terence Crawford, and then you go on to say, we don't want to hear about sides of the street networks and promoters. We want to get the fight done. Well, don't dismiss the other fights that are just as big as Errol Spence and Terence Crawford. Now, it might not bring in the same revenue, but for hardcore boxing fans, this fight, Shawn Porter and Terence Crawford, would do a lot for the sport of boxing. It's entertaining, it's exciting, and it's two massive names that have never, Terence Crawford has never lost, and Shawn Porter has never been blown out. So the rubber meets the road, so to speak. Something's going to give. You never seen Terence Crawford in there with a style like Shawn Porter. Actually, you never seen anybody in there with a style like Shawn Porter until they're actually in there with Shawn Porter. So Terence Crawford, who likes to fight on the inside, who we've seen in vulnerable positions at times in fights and hurt, who knows what's the outcome going to be. So to dismiss Shawn Porter in favor of just wanting to see Errol Spence and leaning towards it doesn't matter who Terence Crawford fights until he fights Errol Spence, and claiming that Errol Spence and the networks need to make this fight happen is irresponsible on the part of Max Kellerman. Shawn Porter is a great, viable opponent for Terence Crawford, and he's a legacy fight for Terence Crawford. That fight needs to happen. As Errol Spence already went through that gauntlet, as Kell Brook already went through that gauntlet, as Keith Thurman already went through that gauntlet, Terence Crawford needs to go through that gauntlet. So Max Kellerman is irresponsible on your part to dismiss Shawn Porter. So let's see how this all plays out, because Bob Arum, legendary promoter and CEO of Top Rank, who currently promotes Terence Crawford, recently told me personally that that's a fight that he would love to make next should Terence Crawford get past his respective upcoming opponent in Kell Brook, November 14th. So let's see how everything plays out. But drop a comment in the comment section. Let me know what y'all think. Y'all already know what it is. It's your boy Blue, Blue Blood Sports TV. Hate, like, comment, and subscribe. You haven't subscribed, hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, hit the bell icon to get all the new notifications. Follow me on Instagram at Blue Blood Sports TV, or one word. Y'all already know what it is. Shout out to the entire LDBC. Shout out to New Media. Shout out to Black Media Row. Make sure you like and share the videos. That's all I got for y'all. Peace.